Hi there, good afternoon and welcome to UCLA Connections. I'm Carla Denley, Assistant Dean for Communications at the Fielding School of Public Health here at UCLA. I appreciate you joining us for today's discussion about xenophobia and racism in context of COVID-19. We're also going to talk about ways that each of us can take action to address discrimination. So just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. Today's webinar is being recorded, as you probably already saw. The session will be available later at ucla.edu/connections. And please note that the Zoom chat and Q&A functions have been disabled, but we received a number of really good questions from all of you and our audience, and we're going to get to those today. So now I'm delighted to introduce Professor Gilbert Gee. And so Gil is a professor of community health sciences at the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. And he also has a courtesy appointment in UCLA's Asian American Studies Department. And so a primary aspect of the research that Gil does focuses on conceptualizing and also measuring racial discrimination, and also in understanding how discrimination may be related to illness, which we're going to talk about today. So Gil has worked in public health for more than 20 years, and over the course of his tenure to date, he has worked on health surveys and disease exposure that has been recognized by the National Institutes of Health and the Environmental Protection Agency. He served as editor-in-chief of the Journal of Health and Social Behavior, and he recently served on a National Academy of Medicine panel that helped create a plan for monitoring the overall health of people in the United States. So I'm delighted now to welcome Gil. So thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for that kind introduction. I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. Thanks, Gil. We're so happy to have you. So I want to start by talking about the connection between health and discrimination generally before we dive in. So will you please share with us how they're connected and also the toll that discrimination can have on our health and well-being long-term?
Yeah, certainly. So, we know that discrimination and racism are certainly important issues in their own right. It's intrinsically the right thing to do to be anti-discriminatory and to have policies that promote equity and social justice. But it's also a public health issue. We know from hundreds of studies, not only in the United States, but around the world, that when people report experiencing discrimination, they're more likely to be sick. And so this can take the form of overt hate crimes that can lead to not only just death and injury, but also more subtle things of, just being treated unfairly, what people might call microaggressions that on a day-to-day basis can take their toll and make people sick in terms of things like heart disease, compensatory behaviors like substance use, and even suicide. And so racism is not just a civil rights issue, but it's a public health one in many, many ways.
Yeah, and so I actually want to talk about the public health consequences quickly of discrimination. So will you share with us a bit about the domino effect that exists, when people experience discrimination, and by that I mean, like, for example, some folks might be reluctant to seek care, right? Mm-hmm. So talk to me just a bit about that.
Yeah, so discrimination can have a lot of different effects, especially at the individual level. So on the one hand, it can stress people out. And so we know from a century's worth of research that stress can impair the immune system and it can change how people behave. So for example, it can affect your sleep and it can affect what you eat and drink and your propensity to, do things like use tobacco. Because we know that when people are stressed out, they try to find ways to cope. And some of those coping ways that people cope can make them sick, like tobacco use. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, discrimination can have ripple effects in other ways. So for example, we know that discrimination can cause some people to lose their jobs. And so we also know that, of course, that when people are employed and they have good health insurance, that they're more likely to be healthy and, engage in preventative healthcare and things like that. And then we also know that discrimination that's more broad, such as, for example, where environmental toxins are dumped, also matters as well. So we can see the effects of discrimination on health at multiple levels, ranging from sort of the broad social policy level all the way down to the level of cells. And there's actually even some research that's emerging showing that evidence that cells themselves age a little faster when people are stressed out by things such as discrimination.
Yeah, and so we'll get to that. The difference when we talk about stressors, there are some we choose, right? And then there are some that unfortunately, those burdens are given to us. So before we actually dive into COVID-19, because, we're talking a lot about the power of language. So I want to talk a bit about the historical context, if you will. So please share with us how we as a global community have named pandemics and also what's changed in recent years.
Yeah, so before I get into that, let me take a step back. There's this longstanding use of science to try to prove that racial groups are biologically and socially inferior. So if you go back about 200 years, there's this whole body of research that tried to show that, certain groups were more intelligent or less intelligent. And a lot of it was used to justify things such as slavery. And so we started to invent diseases such as kleptomania, which was the disease of slaves running away from their masters. I think today we might think that's sort of a natural response, that if you're enslaved, you want to be free. But slavery was used as a means to justify the science, and the science was also used as a means to justify slavery as well. And so there's definitely been this longstanding connection by writers and doctors, such as that where they invented these diseases, and they connected those diseases not only to people from Africa, but to people from Asia. So people were writing about how Asians and people from China were the sources of leprosy, as an example. So we've started to create this long connection between sort of biological inferiority and the use of medicine and science to justify it. Those kinds of thought processes have led to things like the infamous Tuskegee study. If you're not familiar with it, if you are, as a quick reminder, it's a study that people, when they look at Ethics 101, Research Ethics 101, it's one of the most famous case studies. And the idea behind what happened with the syphilis study, right, was that we actually had information about the natural course of syphilis, but there was a belief that African descendants expressed or had, expressed syphilis differently. So they created a whole new study where they, let people have syphilis and without any kind of treatment, even though treatment was available. And that study since then, has been seen as sort of a misuse of science, but it was based on this belief that Black bodies were biologically different than white bodies. So that whole kind of way of thinking that biological differences exist between races has led to also this idea of connecting pandemics to racial groups. And so, we started naming pandemics and connecting them to people. And so now, as you know, there's this big controversy over the term COVID-19 versus coronavirus. And so we have this long history. And certainly people have pointed out saying that, well, the World Health Organization and the Center for Disease Control and the American Medical Association, for example, has said that we should use neutral terms such as COVID-19, which is the scientific term for the disease, whereas some politicians have decided that they'd rather use phrases such as China virus. And people have justified it on the use that, well, we've used similar terms like the Spanish flu as an example. And so it's almost hypocritical if you're saying that, oh, we shouldn't use these terms anymore. But there's a couple of things that are important to remember. So the terms that we used to use before, like Ebola, the Spanish flu, SARS, etc., all came before 2015. But in the year 2015, that's when the World Health Organization has said, you know what, we've done this in the past of naming diseases associated with places or people or even livestock like the swine flu. And they decided that we've actually seen a lot of harm come to communities that are so named. And so moving forward, we recommend that we don't use that kind of naming system anymore. And so that's why the World Health Organization after 2015 has said we should use these more scientific labels. But we can start to see that there are these ripple effects of these kind of naming conventions across the various communities.
Yeah, we as a global community, unfortunately, don't have a great record, when it comes to that. Remind me, please, what was the original name of what we now know to be, it's an acronym, but AIDS?
Oh, so AIDS used to be called gay-related immune deficiency,
Wow.
GRID. Yeah, and so we realized quickly that that sort of calling it gay-related didn't help much at all. And in fact, many people who were not gay were getting affected by AIDS. And so we started to change the name for that.
Yeah, of course, of course. So I want to bring us up to, COVID-19 now today. So it's my understanding that you're collaborating with colleagues from a number a number of academic institutions to look at language that people are using, inputs on social media related to COVID-19. So I know that the study is still in its early stage, but, I'd love to hear a bit from you about what you're finding, what you and your colleagues are finding.
Yeah, so we're doing an analysis looking at what's going on in social media, so like Twitter and platforms such as that. And there's been a lot of essentially racist language out in cyberspace. And if you can pull up a couple of slides, let me just give you a few examples. Trigger warning here. They're a little bit offensive. So let's see, here's the first one. So what do you say that we just drop an atomic bomb on these chinks and stop the coronavirus for good? And then let's move to the next one. When I see a China boy coughing, the solution is to kill the virus. And of course, you can see the picture of this person with a handgun. And there's a couple of quotes next to that. You can close the slides now. But you can see that there's this proliferation of tweets and memes and all these various phrases that are emerging in cyberspace and on the internet. And they seem to correlate with the language that we use. And so I'm working with some computer scientists to look at what's going on in terms of changes of negative speech and hate words in relation to Asian Americans. And what we're generally finding is that since COVID-19 has appeared, we're seeing a rise in anti-Asian sentiment on the internet. And the two examples I just gave you are some of the things that are emerging from that research. And also, we're also seeing that the words matter. So if we look at hashtags with the words Chinese virus, you see more hate speech compared to using the phrase COVID-19. Mm-hmm. And so it seems to matter. It seems the terminology we use can sort of incite people to be emboldened to use more inflammatory language. And it is a pretty disturbing trend. And I know many people in the community are feeling nervous. There's also been a rise in the reporting of anti-Asian hate crimes that have surfaced. And at the end of March, the FBI actually issued a warning saying that we're expecting a major spike in anti-Asian hate crimes as well.
So, obviously it's very upsetting. And so for the people who are experiencing this discrimination, whether it's racial discrimination or any other kind, it's really upsetting. So help us take some action, right? So part of why we're here today is to learn more and have some context, but we also want to know what we can do. So, if you would to talk us through some safe ways for people who are, targets of online racial discrimination to respond, and also for allies, if you will.
Yeah. So, if somebody is the target of, say, a racial slur or a hate crime, there's a lot of different things they can do. I think it's really important for people not to feel like they brought it upon themselves. Right. I think that's first and foremost an important thing just to realize, because sometimes it's really common for people who are the survivors of hate crimes, but other things like sexual assault and battery to feel like they brought it upon themselves. But really, they're not to blame, but it's the perpetrators. The next important thing to keep in mind is to find a way to be safe. So if in the moment, you feel that things are escalating, you need to somehow get out of there, and find a safe place or be in a larger group of people, usually just bringing some attention to it so that you're not alone. If there's a perpetrator right in your face, that can help. It doesn't always help, but trying to find a way to be safe. If after the incident occurs, you have the inclination to report it, that's actually a really good thing to do, because documentation that these hate crimes are occurring help in terms of the policy response. It helps people who are policymakers say, oh, wow, we do see a spike in discrimination of this kind. Maybe we really should do something about it. I do recognize, though, that reporting it is a difficult thing, because a lot of times people feel essentially re-victimized when they're asked to prove what happened, or they have to relive it. So that's a difficult thing. And if you are in a place where you feel like you want to do this, but you need a little extra help, it's nice to bring a friend, and maybe you can do that. And at the end of this, I'll give you a website where we can report things, not only to the formal channels of the police, but to a community-led initiative that was built by members of the community and various organizations called Stop AAPI Hate, where you can report things that you may not feel comfortable reporting to the authorities, more formal authorities. There are many things that allies can do, and I think allies play a hugely important role. Allies can intervene in the moment. So if you are in a space where you see somebody else being bullied or harassed in many ways, you can do things such as just cough and make a little noise. You can drop your keys so that the perpetrator knows that they're being watched, so you can do something like that. Another thing you can do is become a physical barrier. Literally step between the two people, so that you can create a little bit of space, and if you have other things with you like grocery bags or a backpack, you can use those things to create a little bit more physical distance that may sort of help tone things down.
Sure.
Yeah. And then, if somehow it doesn't feel safe for you to do something like that, when the incident is over in the moment, you could go over to the person who experienced it and just say, are you okay? Is there anything you want to talk about? I'm here to listen if you want, but if not, that's okay too. So, not really kind of imposing yourself, but showing that you're there if they want to. And I think it's important to be respectful in that way. And so those are a few things that both the person who's experiencing it, as well as bystanders and allies can do to help.
Yeah, and so I want to come back though to social media for just a minute, because for an ally, right? So if you see something that's been posted and you completely disagree with it and it's certainly wrong, I think that sometimes there's a hesitation to engage. So the thought that, oh, well, if I respond pointing out what's wrong or saying anything in response, we might actually escalate things, or, I'm never going to convince this person, is it worth my time? So when we talk about like online as opposed to in person, what is it that you can advise allies to do?
Yeah. So online, I mean, one option certainly is to post something, and you can post something to say, to the perpetrator and say what you're saying is not appropriate. Or you could post something in support of the person who's being attacked, and you can, say something kind, to them, either personally, like in private, or you could post it in public. But I think having some kind of response is good, because I think it shows solidarity, and I think that people feel emboldened to say more prejudicial things if they feel like, people are others are on their side. So sometimes, what people say is silence is complicity. Yeah. And so you might want to keep that in mind. Also, if you are in a position where you are a moderator, of a website, or you can point this out to a moderator. If you
Mhm.
flag hateful speech to, various platforms like YouTube and whatnot, they do check and investigate, and they might start erasing some of that as well. So
Yeah,
those are
that's a
some,
good reminder.
yeah, those are some things you can do. And then there's a few social movements out there as well, expressing solidarity. And so those are a few other options for people to take action to.
Great, great. So, I want to ask you a question from our audience. So, we know that our country has a long and complicated history, and that, that's a nice way of putting it, but, that many groups have been disenfranchised.
Yeah,
So, looking through this lens, if you will, please share with us a bit about race relations and health disparities today
yeah,
related to the Asian American community.
sure. So yeah, I think it's important to put all of this in a broader context, right? So COVID-19 is essentially the latest incident of anti-Asian discrimination. I think oftentimes Asians are an easy target in the sense that, Asians are viewed as a model minority that are economically successful and more healthy than not on average. But the reality is that, many Asian Americans, are disenfranchised economically and have encountered a long history of discrimination. Many of people have probably read, in the history books about the Chinese Exclusion Acts and all that. And it's important to keep all those ideas in perspective. But also, we are part of a broader system where many other communities are discriminated against. So certainly the legacy of slavery for African Americans,
Mhm.
as well as the misogyny that affects women. So if we take an intersectional lens,
Mhm.
we look at all these systems of oppression working together, Asian Americans are not alone. And so it's really important for us to build bridges across communities to say that, okay, we recognize that we are all working together to advance, equity and social justice across different communities. So that's why it's important, for example, for Asian Americans to speak out for, say, the Me Too movement, and also for things like Black Lives Matter.
Mhm. Absolutely. And so another question from our audience, and I think that this is a good one for folks who work in research because, I know I don't have to tell you, but when we talk about wanting to affect change, for the most part, we need to do that ultimately at the policy level. But how do we get there? We have to start by doing the research, having people like you do it for us, and in building that pool of data. So the question is, how can we build trust in the research data presented in the global community for folks who might not be prone to believe it at first blush?
Yeah. So this is I think, a multi-layered issue, right? So part of it has to do with school. When children are learning the ABCs and things like that, a lot of people are nervous about math and the sciences and things like that. And I think the more we can encourage children to appreciate, quantitative analysis of various kinds, and it doesn't have to be quantitative, but just the nature of inquiry, I think is really important. That really helps set the stage for people to have a better appreciation for data, and to understand that sometimes data that are out there may not coincide with their expectations of what they think is really happening. But if you find a way to look at the data objectively, or at least understand that there's lots of different points of view,
Mhm.
um, that's going to be useful. Because I think right now we're in a period where skepticism of science and research and data is presenting major barriers to public health. COVID-19 is one piece of it, but the vaccination stuff is another part of it. The anti-vax movement is another part of it. So I think that, there's a lot we can do to help each other to better appreciate and understand science. And also for us researchers, I think we need to do a better job of communicating our research for lay audiences. I think it's really difficult in our training as scientists because, we're taught to be very careful and very cautious about talking about our research and discussing what it means. And that caution and skepticism is very warranted. I think the what happens though is sometimes these research papers are put out and put into the mainstream discussion, and people don't understand that scientific research is always a dialogue. It's a back and forth, and we find something that might show that X is related to Y, and then a few months later we find the opposite, and then people who don't understand the scientific process don't realize that it is this back and forth, that we start to refine our knowledge, and we depend on being able to replicate or not replicate research so that we ultimately find out what's really going on. But when people are just taking snippets of information, they may get confused, and then they just kind of throw up their hands.
Yeah, so another aspect of that, pardon me, of that process, is the media, right? So, if we sort of end with new policy and we start with new ideas, so, the media play an important role in conveying information to the public, including research, all the time. But, I'm curious to hear your take on media coverage that's happening now in this time of COVID-19 as it relates to discrimination.
Yeah, I think the media response on discrimination has been really interesting and incredible in some ways. So on the one hand, some of the media has contributed to the anti-Asian stigma and discrimination that's going on out there. But at the same time, what I've been really impressed by is the fact that media coverage on discrimination amongst Asians has been tremendous. There's been coverage that's been ongoing since December, and it continues to be out there. A lot of times, if you look back on other similar issues like SARS, there was discrimination against Asians that was emerging with regards to SARS, but we didn't see nearly as much coverage. I think the coverage has been exponential.
Mm-hmm.
That comes, I think, from a lot of different sources, both from, say, smaller local newspapers all the way to bigger, larger newspapers like the New York Times, as well as global newspapers that have been talking about discrimination against Asian Americans. And it didn't just happen and fade away. I mean, the coverage has been ongoing, so lots of different people saying it in various ways. And to me, that's been extremely impressive.
Good. So, a bit of a sidebar, but I want to ask you just briefly. So, there has been a lot of coverage. It has, addressed discrimination, but, there have been some less shining moments. So, for example, there was, a large scale media outlet that put out a story relatively recently about a new kind of hornet that had made its way to America, the quote unquote, Asian mortar hornets. So, talk to me about how that actually connects with how we name things like pandemics. And, again, this is not new, right? We named hurricanes for many years only after women and spoke about them as temperamental. So, just help the audience and I understand a bit about how we can all be more proactive and more mindful with the language that we use.
Yeah. So, going back to what I had mentioned earlier about connecting races and using science and all that, so part of it was this idea, this longstanding theme of what people have called the yellow peril, that Asia would, China, Japan, et cetera, would come and essentially take over the world or take over the United States or the East and the West and whatnot. And so this narrative of, bad things originating from China or broader parts of Asia, is part of this whole idea of what's going on with the naming of COVID-19. But then, what's in some ways ironic is many of the newspapers like the New York Times and others have said, yeah, we really want to stick with the scientific nomenclature when we can. But then at the same time, they turn around and then start talking about the, Asian beetle, for example, this, or the Asian murder hornets, and then there's other coverage on the Japanese beetle, for example. So again, we're connecting a plague with a country or a place, and it just kind of reinforces this broader narrative of the yellow peril. And so sometimes we might see why the words we use are consequential for one sort of particular thing like COVID-19 because we've had a conversation about it. But then, 3 days later we forget, and then we're just kind of talking about, the Asian murder hornets, and we just kind of forget about what the big picture implication of that kind of, what those words really mean.
Yeah, yeah. We have a ways to go, right? There's no debating that, but I appreciate you making time to be with us today and having this conversation. I think it's a good place to start, right? We have to start somewhere. And so unfortunately, we're nearing the end of our time. Gil brought with him today a list of resources. So we have a slide with just a few that we would love to share.
Mhm.
And yep, so we'll go past this. Yeah, and so actually, do you mind please going back to the previous slide about what we can do? So Gil, is there anything you want to share with our audience there before we go?
Yeah, so I've mentioned a few of the things that we can think about doing, both as persons who experience discrimination, but also as allies. But one other thing I want to point out is, for all of us, we can advocate, donate, and vote, right? So we can go and support the various organizations that are out there that are working against discrimination. If we can't be out there physically, or if we don't feel like we have the ability to have a voice through writing or through words, you can, if you have some resources, donate money, or you could donate time and other things like that and show your support. And finally, you can also vote for policymakers who are proactive in terms of being kind and civil and thinking about disparities and fixing those kind of more fundamental problems that we have.
Great, great. And then if you would please to go to the next slide. So we just want to mention, so the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council can actually report hate crimes there. UCLA's Asian American Studies Center has this fantastic COVID-19 multilingual resource hub. And then the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health has a COVID-19 information page, which links out to a number of resources as well. So thank you so much, Gil, for making time to be with us today and for providing us with a bit of a deeper understanding, about this intersection of COVID-19 and racism and xenophobia. And thank you to all of you for joining us for this conversation and for sharing your insightful questions. A reminder that you can find the recording of today's conversation as well as a library of other UCLA Connections webinars on our website at ucla.edu/connections. And I hope you'll join us next Wednesday, June 3rd, when we're going to speak with Dr. Wendy Slesser about food literacy and access to nutritious food during COVID-19. So in the interim, we wish you continued good health and wellness. Take good care. Bye, everyone.